we suffer from this kind of engineering paradigm where people have very much thought that we have the agency to do a conflict analysis, and based on a conflict analysis we can identify what is the problem in that society, and then we can come up with solutions, and we can introduce those solutions to the society. And we used to have a fair sense of confidence that if we introduce those solutions, that society will become peaceful. And if they don't, we normally blamed that we didn't implement well enough, or that there was some other reason why we never thought or challenged the theory behind that or those assumptions behind that. But I think, and we call that the kind of determined designed approach, this idea that we have the agency as experts on conflict, on peace, to be able to analyze a specific situation and come up with a solution, and then introduce that solution through programmatic activity and so forth. Of course, it's very closely linked also to, let's say, traditional developmental thinking, right? And I think complexity has really helped us to understand why that has not worked, and to think of alternative approaches that we need to follow to try to understand and analyze conflict. What we need to do to prevent conflict starts long before we even think about conflict. Right? If we wait until there's some form of conflict emerging, which needs some kind of a peace and security response, the United Nations needs to send a special envoy, or we need to do a fact-finding mission, then in a sense it's already too late. And so thinking of prevention as something that starts much earlier, which basically means that you need to use developmental or other tools very early on in a process or in a society when you see there are inequality or there's other tensions emerging, that you should already at that stage try to work with that. From a complexity lens, it's trying to nudge and influence the situation. Nobody is in control. It's a self-organizing international system. Some actors like the Security Council or the US is maybe more influential than others, and they can try to intervene through sanctions or other steps to try and influence behavior in that system. But nobody can control actually what's going to happen. You can just continuously try to adapt, co-evolve with that situation, take steps to try and keep it from exploding into war. Focus then shifts in a sense away from bodies like the United Nations to countries and societies and civil society, because they are the ones who are able to deal with situations long before they become potentially conflict. And that's where this focus is then shifted to the need to invest in the resilience and the social capital of societies, of civil society, of social institutions, so that they are able to engage with and address issues that may become conflicts later if we don't address them. I think this complexity approach has a very specific ethical implications. One is that you cannot rely on the norms of an ideology to excuse what you're doing, or you can't rely on saying, well, this worked very well in South Africa, so that's why I applied it here. I'm sorry it didn't work out, And now you're in a situation where you know that in this context we do not have prior knowledge that is somehow superior. I have to engage with the situation. I have to make sense of it. I have to make judgments, and I have to accept my ethical responsibility of the judgments I make in that moment. And I'm responsible because I'm the one making this decision. And that will hopefully lead me to then also be very careful about causing harm, about considering unintended consequences. So I think it's a very responsible, engaging ethics that come with it. It's a context which requires everyone who's in the situation of power of making these kind of decisions to take responsibility, because you can't rely on knowledge from elsewhere that you are just implementing on behalf of somebody else. If we understand societies as complex social systems, and we think of them as empirically complex, in other words, it means that the societies, the way they operate, are highly dynamic, they are non-linear, they are emergent. And we know that means that we are unable to study those conflicts or those societies then in a way that means that we could easily understand exactly what is happening and able to predict what will happen next. I think one of the key things is that if we accept that the knowledge we have of any society in a conflict situation where we're trying to understand the conflict, that whatever knowledge we can possibly gather is provisional. It's how we can understand that situation at the moment, but that situation is continuously evolving. So we have to accept that our knowledge is provisional and updated regularly. So very often in the kind of peace areas where I work with the United Nations or with the African Union, people tend to do a conflict analysis at the beginning of engaging with the situation, and then they will deploy a peace operation or peace building programming, and they may only return to that conflict analysis if something significant has changed, or some years have passed and somebody thinks, that conflict analysis is 3 years old now, we should probably update it. But what I think complexity tells us is that this is something that has to be done continuously in order to understand how the situation evolves, and that so you can co-evolve or co-develop your knowledge continuously together with the situation. And the other thing that complexity tells us is that, I mentioned earlier that complex social systems are, of course, highly dynamic and non-linear and emergent. One thing that I think is very important for my understanding of complex systems is the degree to which they are self-organized. And that tells us that for a society to find a self-sustainable solution, that solution has to be somehow grounded in that context, and it has to somehow emerge from that situation itself. We can see from our past experience and from the theory that complexity introduces into this thinking that it's not possible to transplant a solution from elsewhere. Something that worked in Northern Ireland will not necessarily work in South Africa, just as something that worked in South Africa does not necessarily work elsewhere. People like me and many others have made a living on have the South African tag, and others think, oh, you must have something important to tell us. Come and tell us about your Truth and Reconciliation Commission or about your National Peace Accord. People have tried to apply that in Liberia and Sierra Leone and various other places, and some of the critical elements that made it work here wasn't present in those circumstances, right? So this idea that the solutions we have to find has to be grounded in the context, and very importantly that the people embedded in that situation have to be very much part of the solution. One of the things I found very useful is, I don't know if some of you may have come across Donatella Meadows, who have this specific concept of these 12 factors or ways in which we can consider to influence conflict systems. And I find it very useful because a lot of the things that we do in the peace world have very low leverage according to her scale, which is very interesting. We do things like training. We train people and to give them more capacity in negotiation skills or conflict resolution skills. And we think that will, transform the society. Or we do things like change legislation in a certain sector. Let's say in the justice sector, we think if we improve, we build new courtrooms and we help to deploy judges and we change some laws in that particular area, perhaps maybe on, for instance, gender equality, or we develop laws making certain practices criminal. And then we find over time that actually doesn't really transform the society, because it maybe touches on one element of the system, or it works with something that has a fairly low leverage. And as we can see from Donella Meadows' advice, we really need to try and work at the rules of the system, or work at the level of changing the paradigms. And of course, that is not, or that's the most difficult, and that's not things that always happen very fast. But what we also notice is, and this I think is also something that complexity helps us to understand, is that things can be stable for a fairly long period, and then there could be sudden moments of flux or turbulence, and that those periods are very good periods for trying to change the bigger things, the things at the higher order. Right? it may not be possible in a normal, relatively stable period to work at the level of rules or paradigms. And you may have to work at lower levels in that order. But if you can anticipate and read, when those opportunities come to work at the higher level, then certainly you need to embrace those and see how you can then work at that level. When we are able to change paradigms or even certain types of behavior, there are normally winners and losers in these situations. There are people that are gaining from the current situation and that will resist change. And you need to read and understand that situation to understand, where the people are, where the power play is at in terms of making those changes. And I think this is one of the ways, again, in which the field we're working in is so different from the kind of traditional engineering or medical type of problem solving. Right? Imagine an engineer building a bridge where the bridge is working against the engineer, right? Trying to dismantle itself as fast as the engineer is trying to build the bridge. So that is a very important part of what we do is engaging with societies where some parts of that society is actively working against what you are trying to achieve, and you have to understand what is possible. There may be things that the right thing to do, but at that moment, based on how the power relations are, it may not be something that will fly, and you have to try something else under that circumstances. So we see with development interventions, with peace interventions, that sometimes we cause harm despite all our good intentions. But I think something that the complexity lens helps us again is to understand is that we should not think of this as something extraordinary or a surprise. We should anticipate it. We know that when we engage with social systems, they will respond in a range of different ways. And it means that when you monitor your intervention, don't just look for the things that you intended to happen. You need to monitor quite broadly to try and anticipate and pick up any unintended consequences or harm that you may be causing, so that you can step up and respond to those and change your behavior as you go along. I work with which I've called adaptive peace building or adaptive peace. It's a way of coping with a very uncertain, complex situation. So what the adaptive approach does is it generates a number of exploratory ways in which you can try and nudge the society in a certain direction. So you have a variety of engagement, not just one. Again, typical of the traditional approach, you do an analysis and you come up with one solution and you implement that solution. The adaptive approach says, no, experiment, employ a number of different ways simultaneously, and then in a relatively short cycle, assess which of those different ways that you've attempted to nudge the system are having the kind of effects that you would like to have. So, and then make sure you have a strong feedback mechanism that can help you to monitor and understand how these different interventions are what effects they are having, so that you can then reach a moment, and this is very important, to iteratively have this decision-making moment regularly, where you then take a step back and say, okay, which of these different ideas that I've tried to intervene with the system seems to be having the effects that I would like to have. And those that are seeming to be working well, you can continue, you can perhaps even expand them. And those that are not working well, you can stop or you can try to make changes. And then you try again and again and again. So it's a cycle that never stops. It's a way of continuously co-evolving with the society. And so the two critical elements of that is variety and selection, right? So that you have a number of different ways to engage, and you must have this ability to select, to decide which of them continue and which don't. And even the ones that work, you need to continue to monitor, because we know in this kind of situation, what worked today will not necessarily work tomorrow. As I mentioned before, you have people actively working against you, or there may be other developments in that society or in that situation, in that context, which result in some entropy setting in a specific intervention, although it worked very well for a while, stopping to have the same kind of effects. It's also because the situation is non-linear. Right? We tend to expect that things will progressively work. So if a little bit of foreign aid has worked in a certain situation, then we think more aid will work even better. But because of non-linearity and asymmetry, that often is not the case. And so that's why you have to constantly monitor and assess and make sure that you're not causing harm, and try to understand which of the things you're doing need to stop. And of course, this is quite difficult in many institutions because people are adverse to admitting failure. If they think of what they're doing not working as somehow failure. And it's difficult for people to stop something that they've started. So this kind of approach is meant to help people to think differently, to accept that not everything you do is going to be successful. That's normal, and therefore you have to monitor and understand and assess which of the activities you're doing is going to be more successful and less successful, and that becomes your operating model. So if you assess a project or assess a particular institution over a while, and they've not been making these adaptive steps, then you would think that they are not very good at reading their context, and their ability to adapt is not very advanced. So you change the paradigm around and make that the benchmark against which you are judged is the degree to which you are able to adapt, as opposed to the old benchmark, which is the degree to which you're able to implement the project as designed. And if something changed in the way you implemented the project, then you had to go and explain why you're why you're deviating from your plan. That's kind of the old project management style that we want to get away from.